You're standing in line at a U.S. airport. Your bag goes through security like always. You've done this dozens of times, nothing unusual, but this time, something feels different. The officer pauses. Your bag gets pulled aside. Suddenly, a routine trip turns into questioning, delays, maybe even legal trouble. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people who get flagged don't think they did anything wrong. Now think about this carefully. If airport security stopped you today and searched your bag, would you be 100% confident there's nothing inside that could raise a legal issue under the new 2026 rules? I want you to answer that honestly in the comments, yes or no, and explain why. Because what's changed isn't just policy, it's how the law is being applied in real-world situations. Air travel in the United States has always operated under a unique legal environment. Unlike a typical public space, airports, especially security checkpoints, are governed by heightened federal authority. Agencies like the Transportation Security Administration operate under a framework where safety concerns allow for broader search powers than what you'd normally expect under the Constitution. In my legal analysis, understanding these changes starts with recognizing that airport security is not just about transportation. It's about national security, and that distinction matters. Historically, after events like the September 11 attacks, aviation security laws expanded significantly. Congress granted federal agencies increased authority to regulate what passengers can carry, how they are screened, and what constitutes a potential threat. Over time, these rules evolved, often quietly, through administrative updates rather than major headline legislation. The 2026 updates appear to follow that same pattern. They are not necessarily creating entirely new laws, but they are tightening enforcement standards and expanding how existing rules are interpreted. That's where people get caught off guard. There is a strong constitutional argument that airport searches fall under what courts have recognized as administrative searches. These are exceptions to the typical Fourth Amendment requirement for a warrant. Courts have consistently held that because air travel involves public safety risks, limited suspicionless searches are permissible. However, that does not mean there are no limits. Courts would likely examine whether these searches remain reasonable in scope and whether they are truly tied to security concerns. If enforcement becomes overly intrusive or disconnected from legitimate safety objectives, constitutional challenges could arise. Now here's where it gets practical. The items that trigger flags under updated enforcement aren't always obvious. In many cases, they are everyday objects, things people carry without thinking. But context matters, quantity matters, packaging matters, and intent or perceived intent matters even more. For lawful gun owners, this becomes especially important. Federal law does allow firearms to be transported on commercial flights, but only under very strict conditions. The firearm must be unloaded, properly declared, and stored in a locked, hard-sided container within checked baggage. Ammunition must also meet specific guidelines. The issue isn't the legality of ownership, it's compliance with transport rules. In my legal analysis, one of the biggest risks is not intentional violation, it's misunderstanding the procedure. A legally owned firearm that is improperly packed or not declared correctly can quickly turn into a serious legal issue. This is where the Second Amendment discussion becomes relevant. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms, but courts have repeatedly clarified that this right is not unlimited. Regulations on how firearms are carried, transported, and stored, especially in sensitive locations like airports, have generally been upheld. There is a strong constitutional argument that airports qualify as sensitive places where additional restrictions are justified. Courts would likely consider factors like public safety, risk of mass harm, and federal jurisdiction when evaluating these rules. At the same time, lawful gun owners often argue that inconsistent enforcement and unclear guidance create unnecessary legal exposure. And that concern is not without merit. When rules are complex and frequently updated, even responsible individuals can make mistakes. Now let's talk about the Fourth and Fifth Amendment implications. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, but as mentioned earlier, airport security operates under exceptions. You are effectively consenting to screening by choosing to fly. However, that does not eliminate all protections. If a search goes beyond standard screening procedures without proper justification, there could be grounds for legal challenge. Courts would likely examine whether the expanded search was reasonable and directly related to security. The Fifth Amendment becomes relevant if questioning turns into interrogation. If a situation escalates, especially involving prohibited items or undeclared weapons. Anything you say can potentially be used in a legal proceeding. That's why it's critical to remain calm, respectful, and aware of your rights without becoming confrontational. Now consider the federal versus state dynamic. Airports and aviation security are primarily governed by federal law. That means even if something is legal in your home state, it may still be restricted under federal regulations when you enter an airport. This creates a legal gray area for many travelers. For example, certain items that are lawful to possess under state law may still be flagged at a federal checkpoint. This is not necessarily a contradiction. It's a reflection of overlapping jurisdictions. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of airport enforcement. People assume legality at home equals legality everywhere. That assumption can lead to serious consequences. Now let's look at real-world impact. For the average traveler, these updates mean increased scrutiny, more bags being checked, more questions being asked, more delays. For frequent travelers, even small mistakes can become patterns that trigger additional screening in the future. For lawful gun owners, the stakes are even higher. A single compliance error could lead to fines, confiscation, or in some cases, criminal charges. And it's not just about firearms. Other restricted items, especially those that could be interpreted as tools, weapons, or hazardous materials, are being examined more closely under updated enforcement standards. This is where intent becomes critical. Security officers are trained to assess not just what an item is, but how it could be used. That introduces a level of subjectivity into the process. Courts would likely defer to the expertise of security personnel in many of these situations, which makes challenging these decisions more difficult. Now let's talk about legal risks. Non-compliance doesn't always result in arrest, but it can. At minimum, it can lead to delays, confiscation of property, and potential civil penalties. In more serious cases, especially involving undeclared firearms or prohibited items, criminal charges are possible. And once you are in that situation, the legal process becomes complicated very quickly. In my legal analysis, prevention is far more effective than defense in these scenarios. Understanding the rules before you arrive at the airport is one of the most important steps you can take. Now, from a political and policy perspective, these updates are not happening in a vacuum. There is ongoing debate about how to balance individual rights with public safety. Supporters of stricter enforcement argue that evolving threats require proactive measures. They believe that tighter screening reduces risk and enhances overall security. Critics, on the other hand, raise concerns about overreach, lack of transparency, and the potential for inconsistent enforcement. Both perspectives have legal and practical weight. Courts would likely evaluate these policies based on whether they are narrowly tailored to serve a legitimate government interest without unnecessarily infringing on constitutional rights. That's a complex standard, and one that evolves over time. Looking ahead, the long-term implications are significant. If enforcement continues to expand, we may see broader definitions of what constitutes a flagged item. We may also see increased use of technology, data tracking, and behavioral analysis in security screening. This raises new legal questions about privacy, due process, and the limits of administrative authority. There's a strong constitutional argument that these developments will eventually be tested in court. But until then, the practical reality is clear. The responsibility falls on the traveler to understand and comply with the rules as they exist today. So before your next trip, take a moment to think about what's in your bag. Not just what you know is there, but what could be misunderstood. Because at an airport, perception can matter just as much as intent, and a simple oversight can turn into a situation you never expected. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to subscribe for more clear, professional legal insights that actually protect you in real-world situations. And remember, knowing the law isn't optional when you're standing at that checkpoint. It's your first line of defense. The moment your bag is pulled aside, everything changes. What felt routine suddenly becomes serious. And in that moment, most people realize something important. They don't fully understand the rules they're being judged by. And that's the real issue. Because under the current enforcement approach, consistency isn't always guaranteed. One officer may interpret a situation differently than another. One airport may apply stricter scrutiny than the next. And while that discretion is often justified in the name of safety, it also creates uncertainty for ordinary, law-abiding travelers. In my legal analysis, this is where awareness becomes your strongest protection. Courts have historically allowed this level of discretion because aviation security is considered a high-risk environment. But at the same time, courts would likely examine whether that discretion crosses into arbitrariness. If two identical situations lead to completely different outcomes, that raises serious legal questions about fairness and equal application of the law. This is especially relevant when we look at how intent is interpreted. Security officers are trained to assess behavior, context, and potential risk, not just the object itself. That means even lawful items can trigger concern depending on how they are presented or perceived. And once suspicion is raised, the situation can escalate quickly. From a Fourth Amendment standpoint, you are already within a reduced expectation of privacy at an airport checkpoint. That gives authorities broader latitude to search and inspect. But it does not eliminate the requirement that those actions remain reasonable and tied to legitimate security objectives. From a Fifth Amendment perspective, the moment questioning becomes more than routine, your words matter. In my legal analysis, the safest approach is always to remain calm, respectful, and truthful, without volunteering unnecessary information. There is a difference between cooperation and self-incrimination, and understanding that line is critical. For lawful gun owners, the margin for error remains extremely small. Even if your intent is fully legal, even if ownership is lawful, even if you believe you followed the rules, any deviation in storage, declaration, or packaging can trigger enforcement action. And once that process begins, it is no longer just a travel inconvenience. It becomes a legal matter. There is a strong constitutional argument that while the Second Amendment protects ownership, it does not override strict compliance requirements in controlled environments like airports. Courts would likely continue to uphold these transport regulations as long as they are clearly defined and reasonably enforced. But here's the practical reality. Most legal trouble at airports doesn't come from bad intent. It comes from assumptions. Assuming something is allowed. Assuming rules haven't changed. Assuming this won't be a big deal. And that's exactly where people get caught off guard. Supporters of stricter enforcement argue that these measures are necessary. They believe that even small risks must be taken seriously in an aviation context. And from a policy standpoint, that argument carries weight. Prevention is always the goal. At the same time, critics point out that increased discretion can lead to confusion, inconsistency, and unnecessary legal exposure for people who are trying to follow the law. Both perspectives exist, and both are part of the legal reality. Courts would likely continue balancing these competing interests, individual rights on one side, public safety on the other, and that balance will keep evolving as new policies are introduced and challenged. Looking forward, we may see even tighter screening protocols, more advanced detection systems, and broader definitions of what triggers additional scrutiny. That means the responsibility on travelers isn't decreasing, it's increasing. So the question becomes simple. Are you relying on what you think the rules are, or what they actually are right now? Because at an airport, that difference matters more than anywhere else. Before your next trip, take the time to check current regulations. Review what you're carrying. Think about how it could be interpreted, not just by you, but by someone trained to look for risk. That small step can save you from a situation that escalates faster than you expect. If this video gave you clarity, go ahead and hit the like button. It helps more people understand their rights and responsibilities before they find themselves in a real situation. Subscribe to the channel for clear, professional legal breakdowns that keep you informed, prepared, and protected in real-world scenarios. And remember, at airport security, what you don't know can matter just as much as what you carry.